So today's talk is part of our lecture series, Conversations in Forest History. Our guest today is Mike Wurtz. Mike is the head of the University of the Pacific Library's Holt-Atherton Special Collections and Archives. That is the home of the largest collection of John Muir material in the world. An archivist and historian by trade and training, he has a background in studying how geography and history intertwine and have an influence on one another. He is also the author of John Muir's Grand Yosemite, Musings and Sketches. And with that, I'm going to turn things over to Mike.
Thank you so much. And thank you all for having me today. I'm really excited about talking about John Muir and the giant sequoia trees. And of course, I do want to say, that even before we get started, that, as an archivist, I'm a huge supporter of what the Forest History Society Library and Archives does. And really what we do as archivists generally is share information. And in this case, it's about forests and their histories, and honorable. And I definitely support that sort of thing. And I've really found that the Forest History Society has just been amazing with these forest conversations. And I understand on Thursday at this very time, you're going to be talking about Paul Bunyan. So that'll be another reason to tune in later this week. So I encourage everybody to support the Forest History Society all the time, but of course, especially during this week, when we can get that extra little bump there. All right. Well, okay, let's get started. The giant sequoia trees, they were first discovered in 1852 by European Americans. And of course, I'm putting the word discover in quotes there. And they actually came to a relatively small grove, the Calaveras Grove. But you're going to find out that the Calaveras Grove of giant sequoias is kind of like a major player in my talk today, and I'll get a little bit more into that. But as you can see, the very first thing that they did when they found this grand tree, the largest tree that anybody had ever seen in history, the first thing that they thought about doing was cut it down. This is actually 170 years ago this month. They had to use augers because it was so big. They couldn't just get a gigantic saw and cut through this thing. They had to perforate it with a bunch of augers and mining equipment that they had available to them. Well, John Muir visited about 25 years after that tree was taken down. And he wrote, "The laborious vandals had seen the biggest tree in the world, and then forsooth, they must try to see the biggest stump and dance on it." So today, we're going to talk a little bit about how Muir became Treewise and Sequoical. And we're going to kind of follow his pursuits, specifically with the giant sequoia tree, but a little bit about his pursuits in nature generally, how he kind of traced these things, how they kind of move together, and especially the Calaveras Grove and a little bit of that too. Obviously, early on, it's revelry. He's just seeing the trees and nature, and he just revels in it. He talks about everything beautiful, and then later on, he really kind of gets into the tree wiseness, the science of it, trying to understand these trees, trying to understand nature, geology. And then lastly is his preservation, his desire, which is kind of a combination of both sequoiacalness and his tree wiseness, to kind of do what we can to preserve these great trees. So first of all, how did I get tree wise and sequoiacal? Well, that's me celebrating my very first birthday at the Calaveras Grove again. There's Calaveras Grove coming in again. Shortly after that birthday, a few years later, my parents bought a place only about a stone's throw from the Grove. That's me and my siblings standing on Big Stump. We'll come back to that, the same one that they danced on. In the 1980s, I had the opportunity to live close to the Grove, and so I traveled down there quite a bit on walks and campfire programs. In the 1990s, I had the opportunity to organize the Calaveras Big Tree State Park archives. And then in 2004, I got this job here at the University of Pacific. And I've digitized a lot of material. And then if you kind of want to see all things Muir, especially researching Muir, you can look at the URL that's going to be dropped into the chat a little bit here. It's the www.pacific.edu one. I also wrote a book about John Muir in the upper right-hand corner there. Basically, what I did is I went to a number of different places where John Muir stood when he made his drawings, and then you get an idea of exactly where he's standing. There's GPS, or you can find the spot, and then you can also read a little bit about what Muir said when he was there too. And then lastly, in the middle, in the center, is the Muir experience. We have a lot of Muir's personal library and his bookcases as well. And so this became like a little mini museum here at the University of Pacific. So that's my Treewise and Sequoical. How do I know all this stuff? So let's get you Treewise and Sequoical now. You probably know a little bit about these giant trees. If you want to read a little bit more, there's an excellent book, which I'll drop in the URL for the title of that, King Sequoia, the tree that inspired a nation, which even has a chapter practically about John Muir in it. But you know, if you want to get Treewise, you know, these are these gigantic trees. They are, you know, they've got a few different names, and you can kind of see where they're scattered. They're actually in little groves on the the western side of the Sierra Nevada. And you can see the Coast Range out there. We'll talk about that a little bit too. Those are a different type of tree. They're called the coastal redwoods, Sequoia sempervirens, as opposed to the ones that we're talking about, the Sequoia gigantea, which has a number of different names. It has a lot of superlatives. It gets really close to being not only one of the tallest trees in the world, tallest types of trees, it's also one of the oldest types of tree, and it's also one of the largest around. But there are other trees that take those honors. The sempervirens, those cousins I was talking about on the coast, are a little bit taller. The bristlecone pine in Eastern California are a little bit older, and then the baobab tree in Africa are a little bit bigger. But there's still a couple of superlatives that we can still hang our hat on. One is, it is believed that the giant sequoia have the thickest bark. And we also believe that the giant sequoia are the most massive single living stem tree. So they're absolutely massive. And another interesting moniker that they have is that they're the most discovered tree. Now, as you probably can figure, Native Americans had been around these trees much longer before the European Americans had come, but they'd been dispossessed of their traditional habitats. And unfortunately, there's little records of the importance of the trees to the Native Americans from that time of contact. But we'll come back to that a little bit too. Portola and his crew were sailing up the coast of California in the 1700s, and that's when they first got the idea of the redwoods, which are again the coastal redwoods or the sempervirens. And then it was a parade of people like Joseph Walker and John Bidwell that continued to add mystique to this idea of these redwood trees in the Sierra. A lot of people would see them and they would underdocument them. And then when they went to tell people, nobody would ever believe that they could see that there were any trees this gigantic. It wasn't until Augustus T. Dowd, he was working for a mining company at a nearby town, too, Calaveras Big Trees again. When he comes into town one evening, he said that he discovered these gigantic trees. And of course, nobody believed him. And then the story goes is that he tried to figure out a way to convince them. So he went back into town one day and he said, you know what, boys, I found the largest bear in the world. Come help me hunt it. And so they all go running alongside with him until they got up and they saw this magnificent tree. And that's kind of the essential discovery by European Americans of the giant sequoia tree. So, and let's talk a little bit about this guy too. This is, you know, the star of the show today, and that's John Muir. And you can see he's done an awful lot of things, and we can put him a lot of different ways. But I think the most important among these is this idea of a nature writer. He really kind of changed how we view nature and how we interact with nature. And as you know, over the last 50 years, and especially coming to a head in 2020, there was a lot of discussions about his use of derogatory language. You know, we can get very, very deep into that, but I think today we're just going to stick to the trees. But I do encourage you all I'm going to throw another URL here into the chat to keep an eye out for Robert McNally's forthcoming book about John Muir and indigenous people that's coming out next spring, about a year from now. But again, today I'm just going to be focusing on the trees. So let's go all the way back to John Muir's childhood. He was born in Scotland, and his early relationship with trees were probably the same thing that you've had when you were a child too, and that was they were for climbing. He spent a lot of time climbing trees. When he's about 10, 11 years old, his parents moved him, or his father and the rest of his family, they moved to the wilderness of Wisconsin, and he was very excited about moving to America because he'd heard that sugar had come from trees there. So he's very excited about seeing the trees there. But once he gets to Wisconsin, you know, trees become a burden. because he has to, dig out the family, the family grounds so they can grow trees. And so he becomes a family stump digger. And, trees become this whole new thing, but he's still fascinated by him. And he looks at him at every moment that he gets. As a young man, he becomes quite the inventor. He invents all sorts of things. And of course, he builds all these inventions out of wood. So he's using trees again, kind of continuing that connection with trees. And these are a couple of the inventions that we have here. The middle one there is actually a chair. It's called a loafer's chair. And it's a chair that's designed that if you kind of relax too much in it, it actually sets off like a little rifle or a pistol underneath it, and that'll wake you up. So if anybody's getting a little tired from my talking, I think you could quickly make one of these if you want to. So he really gets into this, and he is kind of discovered because of his inventions, and is encouraged to go to the University of Wisconsin. He only goes there for a couple of years, but he studies botany and geology. And, this is when his thirst for botany is really starting to grow. But he finally decides that he's going to, that it was time to move on. He was only going to go to school for a couple of years, and it was time to move on. And he said he was only leaving one university for another, the Wisconsin University for the University of the Wilderness. And when he took off, he was what we would call today an efficiency expert. And he traveled around through Canada mostly at this point, going to factories and helping them kind of improve their systems so they could make more of whatever they happen to be making, like brooms or something like that. He moves to Indianapolis in 1867 or 1866. He ends up in Minneapolis, and it is there that he's working in a carriage factory one evening. And he's got a belt like you see on the left side there. There's a belt, and he needs to loosen the belt. And the only way he can unlace those leather straps is using the sharp end of a file, like I have a picture of there. And what happens is the file gets loose out of his hands. It spins around and jams up into his right eye. And the aqueous humor drips out of his right eye into his hand. And he gently cups his hand, and he goes back to his room that night, and his left eye goes sympathetically blind. And this is the person that we're talking about today, this person that saw all these glorious things in nature and things like that, but he's completely blind. Well, he was pretty much blind for about 3 weeks. He did get his eyesight back, but during that 3 weeks, he was corresponding with a number of different people, including Jean Carr, who is probably the single most influential person in John Muir's life. She was a botanist, and she really encouraged Muir to think about botany and looking at life. And she'd written to him and said, hey, you should look into this Yosemite place. I heard it's pretty cool. You should check it out. And Muir writes back to her, I read a description of Yosemite Valley last year and thought about it almost every day since. And the reason why this is important to the giant sequoia trees is that most things that were written about Yosemite at that time also had chapters about visiting giant sequoia trees, and more specifically, the Calaveras Grove. There are also some groves closer to Yosemite, but they'd always say, go to the Calaveras Grove. And it was at this time that Muir, decides to make haste with all his heart and bade adieu to all thoughts of inventing machinery, and determined to devote the rest of his life to studying the inventions of God. Well, his very first thing that he does is decide to, I'm going to be a full-time botanist, and he takes off on his famed 1,000-mile walk to the Gulf. He sets off, and here he's really reveling in the trees. He's also doing a little bit of science. He's seeing all sorts of trees. That's him in the middle. That's him sleeping in a cemetery. You can see he's got a plant press next to him. You can even see a headstone down by his feet. And some other critters that he drew there. And you can see when he sees a tree in Florida. His goal was to go all the way to South America. He wanted to go into South America and follow in Alexander von Humboldt's footsteps. But he ends up, probably because when he's sleeping in that cemetery without shelter, you can see around his head lots of little dots. Those little dots are mosquitoes, and mosquitoes at that time were carrying malaria in the South. So he got really, really sick, and ended up recuperating on the shores of Florida until he was better and decided, this is it, I'm going to head to California. So he recovers, he sails down to Cuba, and then he sails up to New York, and then through the Isthmus of Panama, where he ends up on the streets of San Francisco in April of 1868, just before his 30th birthday. And he inquires about the quickest way out of town. And somebody says, where do you want to go? And he says, anywhere that is wild. And so he heads off across the Central Valley to the most amazing, the most stupendous place that you can find. Oh, hold on a second, let me get this right. And that is Yosemite. He ends up in Yosemite in 1868. On his way up there, he is told that there's gigantic trees and really, really deep snow. And Muir says, well, it'd be delightful to see snow 10 feet deep and trees 10 feet thick, but I never get lost. He spends about 10 days in Yosemite Valley, kind of getting the feel of things. And before he starts to run out of money, and he realizes he has to get himself a job. And so he begins to head back to the Central Valley of California after being in Yosemite Valley. But before he does that, he passes through the Mariposa Grove, which is not, it's actually really close to Yosemite Valley. And this is when Muir first sees the giant sequoia tree. It's interesting because he writes back to family and friends and he says, traveled on to the Sierra Nevada, to the mammoth trees in the magnificent Yosemite Valley. He just calls them mammoth trees, but he does write about this first view of them in 1868. He says, the greatest tree, greatest of all living things, their noble domes, poised and unchanging reposed, seem to belong to the sky. Well, he makes his way back down to the Central Valley and he gets his job. It's kind of an interesting job. He's kind of a guy who watches a shepherd. He's kind of does a little bit of shepherding, but he's the guy who watches somebody else do the shepherding. And he heads off back up into the high country, the high parts of the Sierra Nevada, to learn everything that he could. And even his boss says, hey, you have the luxury of just going up there and making drawings all day. And so he travels all the way up to the crest of the Sierra. And then on his way back, he stops at the Tuolumne Grove, which is also today within Yosemite National Park. And he sees this gigantic tree. And by the way, this tree is in my book about Muir drawings. And he draws this tree and he says, I found a black charred stump about 30 feet in diameter and 80 or 90 feet high, a venerable, impressive old monument of a tree that in its prime may have been the monarch of the grove. And that's the tree today. It actually has a hole cut through it. There used to be one of the thoroughfares into Yosemite, and they drive through that tree, and that's it today. So he ends up spending, after this, he kind of moves into Yosemite and ends up getting a job in Yosemite. He actually works with trees there too, trees that have been blown down in a recent windstorm. He runs the local sawmill to provide lumber for Yosemite Valley. So he lives there for a while and he's starting to, really getting his chops and his feet under him. And this is when it was in just a couple years after that he writes this letter to Jean Carr, the woman I was talking about earlier, the botanist friend of his. And mind you, this is Muir has already left Scotland. He's left Wisconsin. He's left the universities. He left the factories, always getting a little bit closer and closer to nature. And this letter is the most beautiful letter of John Muir's, in my opinion, and it's a pledge of allegiance to the wilderness. And this is when Muir becomes very sequoical. Remember, the title is Becoming Treewise and Sequoical. This is John Muir becoming sequoical. And if you look really carefully, where is this letter written from and what's the date? He puts, it's written from Squirrelville, Sequoia County, at nut time. So here's John Muir kind of going off the deep end, I guess you could say, Squirrelville at nut time. There is no Squirrelville in California, by the way. And, this letter is just beautiful. He says, I am in the woods, and they are in me. Do behold the king in his glory, King Sequoia. Behold, seems all I can say. Some time ago, I left all for Sequoia, and I have been and am at his feet, fasting and praying for light. And that's a real critical thing there. He says, I left all for Sequoia. So all these things that he left, he's doing it for the giant Sequoia tree, part of the reason that he came to California. He continues, the king tree and me have sworn eternal love, sworn it without swearing. And I've taken sacrament with Douglas squirrel. I've drank Sequoia wine, Sequoia blood. And with its rosy purple dress, I'm writing this woody gospel letter. He's actually using the tannin from inside the cone to create ink to write this letter in Sequoia ink. He also writes, I've never before knew the virtues of Sequoia juice. Seen with its sunbeams in it, its color is the most royal of all royal purples. And then he writes, no wonder the Indians instinctively drink it, for they know not what. Which begs the question to me, well, John Muir, why didn't you ask them? Anyway, he also writes in this letter, I wish I were so drunk in Sequoical that I could preach the green-brown woods to all the juiceless world. And that's kind of a little preliminary look at John Muir thinking about conservation. He continues to revel in these trees. He meets Ralph Waldo Emerson in Yosemite Valley, and the two of them, he convinces him to come to the Mariposa Grove, again, near Yosemite, with Emerson. He really wants Emerson to sleep out at night so he can build a fire, and they could build a fire among the grove. And so they could, quote, revel in the beauty and fragrance of Sequoia flame, how the great trees would stand about us, transfigured in purple light, while the stars looked between the great domes. Well, Muir ended up getting a room that night instead. Later on, Muir writes to Emerson, and he says, you yourself are a Sequoia. Stop and get acquainted with your big brethren. Emerson worked with Galen Clark and ended up naming a tree there called Samoset. That's it there. And this book, this is another drawing that's in my book. I actually have two trees, and you're seeing both of them. But this is also, Muir's getting, he's kind of getting ready to turn to science now. And this is when he's been living in Yosemite for a few years. We're into the, around 1873 or so. And he's really starting to understand, he wants to understand the geology of Yosemite Valley and of the high country and its glacial origins. And so he's really starting to think about science a lot more and how science and nature work together. I mean, he's always been a scientist, but now he's thinking about it a lot more. And he writes to his sister, Sarah, his famous line, the mountains are calling and I must go, and I will work on while I can, studying incessantly. This is another site that I've been to. It's not in the book, maybe a volume 2 someday. So he's getting interested in science of geology and glaciology in particular. And in the meantime, there are others that are writing about the science of the giant sequoia tree, including 19th century botanist Asa Gray. Asa Gray wants to give a speech. He actually talks with John Muir a little bit about preparing this speech. And Asa Gray comes up with a few different ideas about the giant sequoia. One of them, he feels that they're not that old, that there's probably none of them that are older than 2,000 years old. He has some ideas about where they came from. And he's a little bit worried about the extinction of the giant sequoia tree. But really this pamphlet and his talk, he's a good friend and a big supporter of Charles Darwin. And so he writes a little bit more about Darwin and his theories than he does about the trees in this book. In the meantime, Muir continues to travel around looking for trees. This is when he travels south along the Sierra looking for more trees. He's traveling with Albert Kellogg. This is not John or Vernon Kellogg, but this is Albert Kellogg, who is a founding member of the California Academy of Sciences, also a major player in the early days of the giant sequoia tree in the 1850s. They go down to the Kings River area. This is when Muir first witnesses large-scale destruction of the giant sequoia trees. And as you can see, he even uses his book as a plant press. And he sees the General Grant tree as being barbarously destroyed. And then he finally decides, this is it. I really need to do science on these trees. And he sets off with his mule, his brown mule, to explore them. It's about a 2.5-month trip, about 150 miles. His first stop along here, actually he goes to Mariposa Grove first, but his first stop after that is what is now called the Nelder Grove. It used to be called the Fresno Grove. And he writes this article for the 1875 SF Daily Evening Bulletin. And as you can see, he concludes this particular paragraph with, I've also drank it, hoping therefore to improve my color and render myself more tree-wise and sequoical. He comes across this beautiful, gigantic snag that's still there today and really worth a side trip if you ever go to Kings Canyon. And he sees this thing, the wood rings in the sections I laid bare were so involved and contorted in some places that I was not able to determine its exact age, but I counted over 4,000 rings. which showed that this tree was at its prime, swaying in the Sierra wind when Christ walked the earth. No other tree in the world, as far as I know, has looked down as so many centuries as Sequoia. He has an opportunity to see a fire. He says, I met a great fire, and as fire is a master scourge and controller of the distribution of trees, I stopped to watch and learn. Of course, he tired that mule off at a safe distance. But he did notice that how did the tops of these trees that are so tall, how did they catch on fire? And he noticed that the fire would come around to the base of the trees and actually go up through these furrows that you can see on the left side. And they'd whisper all the way up to the top where they'd catch the top of the tree on fire. And that top would burn for days, weeks, or months. He continued southward, wandering around rivers and canyons of Kings Canyon and what is now Sequoia National Park, sees more logging operations, and he even witnesses these scratches on these trees. He says on many of the trees at a height of 6 or 8 feet, their autographs were inscribed in strong, free-flowing strokes on the soft bark where they had stood up like cats to stretch their limbs. He comes across a grove that's so big that he calls it Giant Forest, and that's what it's called today. Now, free man revels in a scene like this, and time goes by unmeasured. And finally, he publishes his article in 1876. At that time, Muir felt that he saw probably about 90% of the groves that existed. Since that time, additional groves have been discovered. The last one was probably 1933. He suggested that they probably migrated from the south. Today, we believe that the giant sequoia probably traveled when the Sierra Nevada was still kind of flat before it hinged upward, that it had come across probably from Nevada area, maybe even further. He thought that the trees mostly grew where the glaciers were not, which is true, but there are other things that might have determined where the trees ended up ending up. And then he was also curious, of course, about extinction, and he felt that they were not going to go extinct. Well, today, if the Sierra continues to get warmer and drier, they probably are in danger of extinction. But of course, the big problem is not natural extinction, it's man-made extinction. And man is in the woods. And Muir is worried about the forest fires and the axes and the destruction are instantaneous. And as you can see here, when the trees when they dropped, they actually shatter. The wood is obviously pretty strong, but it's also weak. It just shatters because they're so gigantic. And by the time they actually do anything with it, they waste anywhere from 1/2 to 3/4 of these trees. And what do they make with them? Well, it looks like this guy's making stakes, but it's probably, or a post of some sort, but they're probably going to get cut up again and made into shakes for roofs, shingles and shakes for housing. And this is when Muir really begins to turn to preservation. And where does he turn to preservation of a number of places? He comes back to my Calaveras Grove again. And this is when he kind of combines treewiseness and sequoical, and he adds a little bit about the utility of rest. He says, we are fond of laws and elect men to make them by the thousands. Then why not enact a law compelling us at least one annual exodus into the woods? Compulsory education may be good, compulsory recreation may be better. And he comes back, for the first time, this is when he visits the big stump, which used to be the discovery tree that was cut down by the augers. You can see it there on the left. The noble monarch now lies a mass of ruins overrun with rubbish and weeds, while a partly fungus-like pavilion has been erected on the stump with the surface plain smooth for a dancing floor. He also says, and this is on the right, most of the larger trees have been slightly disfigured with black glaring names carved on marble tablets and countersunk in the brown bark, producing a shabby tombstone appearance, while the names themselves are a grotesque mixture of misters and missuses and professors and generals and bishops and bachelors and old maids and graces, etc. But he does say, with these exceptions, the groves have been well preserved. So what's going on in the rest of John Muir's life? He meets, we're kind of getting into the late 1880s, early 1890s. He meets Robert Underwood Johnson. And I've got a URL there for a new book that just came out about Muir's relationship with Robert Underwood Johnson. It's the New York Times URL. Thank you. And, he has a campfire with Johnson, and Johnson really kind of lights a fire under Muir to at a campfire, no less, to really work harder at preserving natural spaces. And this is when Muir works really hard to help establish Yosemite National Park, and then also the Sierra Club in 1892, hoping to do something, hoping we'll be able to do something for wildness and make the mountains glad. So Muir is also focusing on preservation in all aspects of his life. He makes his way back down towards the Kings Canyon area. And this is in 1891. So he can write this article, Arrival of Yosemite. The number of mills along the belt and the basins of the Kings, Sequoia, and Tule rivers is doubled since my 1875 trip. He makes this really cool map. This is one of my favorite pieces. This is actually at UC Berkeley, 1891 map that he sent to Johnson. He's actually encouraging him to, that we should make a large reservation of all those southern groves. There are 3 acts of Congress to kind of set aside little hunks of the trees. In 1890, Sequoia National Park and General Grant National Park, which is basically a postage stamp size of what became Kings Canyon. Much later, after Muir's death, Kings Canyon gets its own full-blown park. A number of things, during the 1990s, Muir is, working at his ranch mostly, but he's also leaning into preservation. In 1900, he gets a letter about the Calaveras Grove again, and this is from Charles Lummis, the editor of Land of Sunshine. And he writes to him and he says, "Dear prophet, come gird the sword of Gideon. They're going to cut down our Calaveras big trees. One blast of your bugle horn is worth 1,000 men." And interestingly enough, it was actually the California Club. It was a women's club at that time. And Laura Lyon White, who basically got Congress to pass a joint resolution to direct the negotiations to buy Calaveras big trees and turn it into some sort of national monument or whatever. Unfortunately, there was no money that came with that. And so the park remained, or that the grove remained in private hands. Muir writes, "From first till last, the Calaveras Sequoias have taken over 3 weeks of my time. Now they seem safe." And he really didn't have any plans to go up into the Sierra. He wasn't feeling very well that spring of 1900. And he basically kind of stayed at home. But while he was staying at home, his friend Seahart Merriam was encouraging to come. He says, "I know you're panting for the wilderness. You should come to the Sierra. I want to travel from Tahoe to Yosemite and cross the Sierra 4 times. And I'm going to bring my sister with me, Florence Merriam Bailey, who is, Merriam is a very well-known naturalist, and Bailey is a very well-known ornithologist, and she'd written a lot of legislation to keep feathers off of women's fashion." Anyway, Muir finally writes, "All right, I'll go." That's the way I read it. Who knows? He may have said, "All right, I'll go." Who knows? But anyway, and they travel on, and one of their first stops along the way, one of their first stops is they come back to the Calaveras Grove. And again, Muir writes about the Calaveras Grove, and he says he sees this tree. This is was now called the mother of the forest. That's what it looks like on the right today. But on the left, what they had done, as Muir says, one of the finest in the grove, more than 300 feet high, was skinned alive to a height of 116 feet from the ground to and the bark sent to London to show how fine and big that Calaveras tree. That's as sensible a scheme as skinning our great men would be to prove their greatness. He also writes about the trees generally and them being logged. He says, "No doubt these trees would have made good lumber after passing through a sawmill, as George Washington, after passing through the hands of a French cook, would have made good food. But for both Washington and the tree that bears his name, higher purposes have been found." That there was a while there with the giant sequoia was actually called the Washingtonia gigantea. And I have a picture of Thoreau's Maine woods there, because Muir actually kind of uses some of Thoreau's very writings here. Thoreau wrote, "A pine tree cut down, a dead pine is no more a pine than a dead human carcass is a man." Similarities there. Muir continues to kind of keep the groves and his nature desires on the side. 1909, he travels back again to the southern groves, and he makes one of my favorite drawings of the giant sequoia that he has in his journals and notebooks. Obviously, he visits with Roosevelt in 1903. At that time, they were trying to, they were doing things with the park's boundaries, trying to get them just right. And then in Taft in 1909, and of course, you can see that he's using the giant sequoia trees to talk about nature. He visits them both with the sequoia trees, but with Taft, it was about Hetch Hetchy. And now we're kind of winding down here. He takes a world trip in 1903, and he ends up, at that point, he's in Australia with a gigantic eucalyptus tree. He takes another world trip when he's 73 years old to South America and Africa, and he sees the monkey puzzle tree in South America, and finally visits the baobab tree that I talked about earlier as being the largest around. And he called it one of the great tree days of my lucky life. We believe that probably his last visit to the giant sequoias was at the age of 74, just a couple years before he died. And when he did die, you can see here a member of the Sierra Club placed on the coffin a bough of a Sequoia gigantea, which the naturalist had planted with his own hands near what is now his grave. So the conclusions of this talk are, Muir became Treewise and Sequoical through this revelry, the beauty and the mysticism of the trees, and also studying them, the science and understanding and knowledge, and then lastly, preservation to protect, and a little bit of frustration. And it was through Muir that, we were basically, able to preserve these. Many of the groves exist through federal and state protection. And of course, Muir, just like Hetch Hetchy and some of the challenges there, he couldn't save every single one of them. There's stump meadows out there. There's stripped trees. There are trees with holes cut in them. But if it wasn't for Muir's vision all those years ago, that we can enjoy it much like Muir did all those years ago. And I'm going to leave you with one last quote, his famous one about trees. Any fool can destroy trees. They can't run away. And if they could, they would be destroyed like buffalo, chased and hunted down as long as fun or a dollar could be got out of their bark hides, their leafy branching horns, or magnificent bull backbones. God has cared for these trees, saved them from drought and disease, avalanches, and 1,000 straining, leveling tempests and floods. But he cannot save them from sawmills and fools. This is left to the American people. And thank you.
Thanks, Mike. Just a reminder for folks, please submit your questions through the Q&A forum. There's one there awaiting us, but before we get to that one, I wanted to ask if Muir understood the ecological value or wrote about the ecological value of sequoias. So he's celebrating the trees and he's working to preserve the trees. Did he situate them in the larger ecosystem?
Oh, yeah. Oh boy, yeah. I'd have to think about that one. I think the answer is yes, but I'm trying to think of an easy example. I mean, as an archivist, my brain's quickly thumbing through all the journals and stuff to see where it's like I could give you a quote. But right. There are times when he talks about that for fire, for example, and what's the role of fire within the groves and that sort of thing. But I think this is really good. I think I'm going to make a note of this one because I think I'm curious about that too, because I mean, my point is that the giant sequoia tree is kind of microcosm of how he felt about nature. And this is a pretty good example. And I'll look into that. Thank you. Sure.
So Craig Patterson asks if you can speak to the relationships that Muir had with Gifford Pinchot, founder of the first chief of the U.S. Forest Service, and President Theodore Roosevelt. And so those relationships, and also where they mutually influenced one another and where they disagreed. Craig, I appreciate that question. It's a lot to tackle, and in fact, that's a webinar unto its own. But if you could touch on those relationships and.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, it's the fodder for books and presentations all by itself. But Gifford Pinchot had a different look at how these trees, he saw them for the highest use for the highest number. And Muir spent some time with Gifford Pinchot as well. And, they ended up kind of being opposite each other on a lot of the issues. And it kind of really gets you thinking about nature in general. I mean, I think we could probably collectively say that we all want to save nature. We want to keep nature for different reasons and that sort of thing. But it's interesting because when we get into the details of how do we do that, and that's where you're going to start to find the differences between Pinchot and Muir. And, even when Muir met with Roosevelt in 1903, it's like, yes, we all have the same goal, but how do we go about getting there? And I think that's where Pinchot, really researching more into Pinchot's relationship is a critical question to ask.
Well, I do know that they had a complicated relationship. Char Miller, who's written an environmental biography of Pinchot about 22 years ago, came out, talked about it. I know from my own research that Muir was on record as saying we need we need a forest service, and he favored.
Wasn't prepared.
He favored utilitarian conservation early on.
Yes.
It was later that they divided. I also do want to point out, this is you showed that pretty famous photo of Roosevelt and Muir at Yosemite.
Yeah.
And this is the value of archives in that.
Yeah.
You can find online where people claim Gifford Pinchot is in that very photo. And
really,
we know just definitively he was not.
Okay.
There's a man with a very Pinchot-esque mustache in there, but you may come across that, and if you do and you see this claim that Pinchot is in that photo, he's absolutely not. So it's one of those myths that needs to be put to bed.
Yeah, that the governor of California is in that photograph. Pardee, I'm forgetting his first name right now, because he was all. They were all there because they were discussing specifically the Yosemite Valley was set aside in 1864. It was actually set aside and kind of given to the state of California to manage. 1890, they create this larger park around Yosemite Valley, but the valley itself continued to be managed by the state, as well as the Giant Sequoia Grove, the Mariposa Grove. And so Muir was with Roosevelt in 1900, basically saying, "Hey, let's get the groves and the park and the valley into this gigantic park." Yeah. I've never. Okay. That's a new one to me, that Pinchot was in that picture. So I'll easily quash that one.
Yeah, I've seen it actually in some older Forest Service publications.
Yeah. Okay.
But it's floating around out there. So this is why you need to contact your archives and libraries and librarians and archivists. If there's any question, do so. Speaking of questions, just a reminder to submit them through the Q&A forum. I'm also wondering if you could talk a little bit then about today, and that we know that Yosemite is among the among the crown jewels of national parks, which means also that it's extremely popular for tourists. And what if you were able to talk a little bit about the impact of tourism on specifically the giant sequoias, which again, they're not just in Yosemite, so there's opportunity to see them outside of Yosemite. But anyway, if you could talk about that tourism and preservation and giant sequoias.
Yeah, it's and thank you, Robert, for posting the name of the Pinchot Muir book, Nature Rivals, by John Clayton too. That's another very good one. So it's interesting in the context of especially the giant sequoias and Calaveras big trees. I mean, really the reason why more people went to that grove, it's much smaller than the Mariposa Grove, but people went to it because not only did it have a hotel, but they'd knocked over a tree and put a dance hall on it, and there was a bowling alley there, and it was a festival, more than anything. Later on, they put a hole through another tree, and of course they stripped the mother of the forest, and people could climb up that scaffolding and go up 116 feet in the scaffolding. And so it was more like a little Disneyland. And I'm trying to remember which historian said this, but in the late 1920s, there's a lot of talk about what is a national park, what does it mean? and there's this carnival or cathedral. You know, what's the context that we need to be thinking about here? And, you know, that tourism drives these parks. And how do we, you know, we want people to come to them. And Muir says himself, you know, even in that 1876 article, come to the woods. That's always been his ideas. He wants people to come to these places. And, you know, and I think that the challenge of that, and, you know, the group that published my book about the drawings is the Yosemite Conservancy. And they just completed how many year plan was that? To basically completely renovate, this is going to sound funny, they renovated a grove. Well, anyway, the Mariposa Grove had this long, sinewy drive, you know, you go up it and you'd ride in a little tram that would spout all sorts of disgusting, you know, carbon monoxide and things like that into the air, and you drive up to the top and you get out and you look around, you get back in the thing and you drive back down. They took that out, and they built in a lot of pathways around where the ground was sensitive and things like that. So, you know, this constant struggle between, and I think Muir was lucky enough that he was still at the time when it was like, yeah, keep coming. But it was shortly after his death that we had to make that sharp turn and say, okay, we need to figure out how to preserve this and still make it accessible to the public. And I think that's, you know, even today, I think that's going to continue to be a challenge. Yeah.
Yeah, especially going forward, because of course the world's population continues to grow, and as we're trying to attract people, it's almost like I was going to say it's like a hydra, but that has a negative connotation, right? So, but it is a multi-headed. In other words, it's a very complex issue of, we want people to be exposed to nature, and we want them to visit it, so then they garner an understanding of it and maybe develop a land ethic. And they side on and work towards preserving it. But so many of these parks are being loved to death. I don't know, did they turn to timed entries at Yosemite? Well, during the last few years, I know in some parks they did.
Yeah, in the last few years during the summer, and of course during the pandemic, that it was reservation system. Well, they lifted the reservation system this year for Yosemite, so you can just wander up there anytime you want. And you know, they're always trying new things up there to make sure that everybody gets that Yosemite experience when they go. And I think that's going to be a constant challenge. And of course, it becomes a real challenge when you talk about accessibility for all. You know, if you start, you know, if you start doing reservations, well, what if somebody doesn't have their phone handy and they can't get that reservation at the right time? And, you know, oh yeah, we have some at the gate sometime. You know, and the other thing is they didn't put that. They didn't have reservations for Hetch Hetchy, but of course Hetch Hetchy, you're going out to look at this beautiful valley that's filled with water. Somebody believes that the reservations will return, but as of right now, I understand. I know this summer you don't need reservations to visit the park.
I just saw a package on one of the major networks, news package on Yosemite, because of the snowpack.
Yeah.
For the first time in decades, the waterfalls are this late in the season. Are going full tilt, whereas like around May, most of them would dry up.
Pretty much.
So that's, and so just on the one hand, it was absolutely beauty shots, and I was ready to book a flight and from North Carolina, get out to Yosemite to see these waterfalls. I've been 3-4 times to Yosemite, but in summer. So I've never seen them flowing. Right. But then my next thought was, oh, they're going to be overrun.
And that's what's happening. I mean, I was up there a couple of weeks ago, and at the danger of getting sequoical, it was magical. I mean, it really was something. We did there's a shorter hike where you kind of come around and see a full view of Yosemite Falls, which is actually made up of 3 different fall and 2 fall and a cascade. But when we were around the corner from it, we couldn't quite see it yet. I'm like, what is that sound? And you can just hear this boom, 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 boom. And you come around, it's just like, it's pounding. And that was a few weeks ago. And I think now it's even gone more nuts, and that all the not all, but many of the meadows are flooded. It's just fantastic. And of course, they're not letting anybody go in the river right now, even recreationally, because that's where people die. So.
Well, and of course, they spoke with the ranger, and he was talking. They've already had 2 swiftwater rescues this season.
Yep.
So there was it was interesting to see how they were selling Yosemite, and then cautioning you, because of course they showed. I don't know. It doesn't matter if it was moving footage or still photos of people stepping out as close to the waterfall as possible, putting themselves in danger. Well, from water to fire, Steve Ambrose says, based on the history of fire in this ecosystem, what do you think will happen in the future? Will the giant sequoia survive? You know, if you have the crystal ball that can answer this, I'll be impressed.
Yeah. Well, the good news is we'll probably all be able to see the giant sequoia. Everybody on this Zoom call right now will be able to see the giant sequoia. But you're right. You know, my grandkids and their grandkids, probably. You know, but you know, again, if we continue to face a warmer and drier climate, the giant sequoias, they prefer a little bit more water and a little cooler. Then, you know, they're very little niche that they're in. They're very like this little stripe at, depending upon where you are latitudinally, they're just this little stripe of things that, you know, between 4,000 and 6,000 feet. They've got a very narrow niche that they live in. And of course, you'll see them everywhere. I see one outside my office here at 14 feet in the middle of the valley. But those groves are very niche. And as you noticed in the last couple of years, they've some pretty big fires have swept through the groves. Usually when I tell that story about John Muir witnessing a fire in the grove back in 1875, and how, you know, he just spends 2 or 3 days and nights walking around watching this. And I used to say it would be really cool to see this little fire go up these trees and see that. But, you know, we've let so much grow in over the last 150 years. That's another tragedy too, I think, is there are only a few places where you can stand and see what Muir would have seen. Because, you know, back in the 1870s, you could actually go to a giant sequoia grove and see giant sequoia. Well, even my little grove in Calaveras, it's this beautiful grove, but, you know, you can stand in the same spots that Muir did. And, you know, it's like, okay, there's a giant sequoia, there's one, but all I'm seeing is like cedars and sugar pines and white firs and, you know, ponderosa pines. It's like, you see a lot more. It's cool if you like, you know, if you like looking at trees, but I really someday, I've almost seen it down in some of the Sequoia National Forest, or not Sequoia National Forest, Sequoia National Park. There's a few places where you can stand and just see like, you know, 25 trees just covering your eyesight. So yeah, I don't want to be a doomsayer, but I worry about them too. Yeah.
Yeah. So there, in other words, there are challenges.
Yes.
And humans are one, fires are another. Is it a fire dependent species?
Yeah, actually it really helps to have fire. And that was something that, you know, Muir, you know, he was, of course, you know, at the time everybody was anti-fire, but there is some things in his writings where he talks about, I forgot what it was. He mentioned something about fire. And of course now we know that, you know, you burn the ground off, it gets rid of all the duff, and that the fire actually opens up the cones so the seeds come out and things like that. So yeah, fires are very important, and they do a lot. In fact, Calaveras Grove has been doing prescribed burns in the groves for, oh my gosh, nearly 40 years now, maybe longer.
Okay. Carl Blyler asks, was there an adversarial relationship between Muir and local lumber and logging companies, even though Muir realized that people need wood to live on?
Yeah.
Not to mention he made his living for a while working in a sawmill, correct?
Yeah. Very briefly. That was like probably not longer than a few months, if a year at that. Long story behind that one. But you know, I think he was just kind of getting into trying to protect the trees, and, you know, specifically getting into the, you know, I don't remember him specifically like going up against a logging company. I mean, he'd go and he'd look at the, you know, he'd talk to the people in the mill, and he'd count, you know, he found the mills were great because it was a place where he could count rings and see how old the trees were. But, you know, The closest that he came is, like, again, Calaveras Grove, and even down south, there were times when he would find out that somebody was selling a grove, and that's when he would intervene. He would get in there and say, hey, we need to preserve this grove. Don't sell it. Whatever you do, let's hang on to it so we can, get it, so we can preserve it. So he's really trying to nip it at the bud, I guess, is the best way to put it.
Okay. And then Mark Lewis asks, it's interesting that Muir started out using wood to create his inventions.
Yeah.
And all the pictures that he has in there are houses and furniture made of wood.
Yeah.
Of course, we had, this is long before plastics, et cetera. But did Muir understand well-managed forests sequester and store more carbon, and wood products store carbon? Yeah, here we go. And Mark, this is a good question, and take much less energy to produce.
Wow.
And so Mark concludes, not with a question, but an observation, there needs to be a balance between preservation and conservation.
Right.
But really, the question is, did Muir understand carbon, even in a primitive or basic way?
Oh, wow.
Carbon sequestration.
This is why I'm really happy to be giving this talk to the Forest History Society, because I knew I'd be getting some amazing questions. And it's like, I'm going to be taking a lot of notes. That's a fantastic question. I'm going to look into that. I mean, I remember one person suggesting that Muir did say something about climate. Was Muir noticing the climate changing and that sort of thing? And I know that's not, we're talking apples and oranges. Another thing that, Muir also recognized, the idea of the forest, the pin shows, it wasn't that he was against lumbering wholesale. It's like, these trees we need to protect. And I guess a really good example of that is Hetch Hetchy. Everybody's like, oh, Muir was anti-dam. Well, he wasn't anti-dam. He was anti-putting a dam in a national park in a beautiful valley. I think he recognized, and this would be an interesting thing to learn a little bit more about this. I'm trying to figure out what words they would have used when they talked about carbon sequestration and that sort of thing. Because you can actually search, online, you can search through his journals for keywords, but carbon would be a tricky one.
Well, so that, well, first of all, tell us, it is the University of Pacific, which again houses the largest collection of Muir materials. Is that home to the largest online collection of Muir materials? And it is completely searchable.
Yeah, and well, it's somewhat searchable. I mean, we are still looking for people to help transcribe his journals. I'm going to go ahead and throw this into the chat right now. Let me make sure I did this in the right place. You tell me if you see this. This is our material that we've put online. Now, the correspondence, that's kind of thank you to a lot of different organizations, including UC Berkeley. John Muir's letters are, of course, there's many of them out there. We have the bulk of them, but they're found all over the country. And back in the 80s, they microfilmed all that, and that's all been transcribed and put online. So you can keyword search for Sequoia or whatever. But like the journals and some of the notebooks, we are still having people, and anybody's welcome to do this, is come visit and go to those journals and help us transcribe them. And it's a lot of fun. You'll find out when you look at one that's already been transcribed, you're going to say, well, that's not what that is. And that's really what we need, is really it's about harvesting words. So we can look up words like carbon. And then, of course, in the reading bibliography that's also on there, those are all of Muir's articles. And those are, unless it's a link to an article that's out there, they are also keyword searchable. You can look up Sequoical.
We have a question came in. Can you comment on the use of the terms conservation and preservation as they were used or understood in Muir's time, especially the late 1880s? Of course, today in the United States, there's clear distinctions and connotations. This person, I don't know if they're in Europe, doesn't matter, but they say it's less clear in Europe, these two terms. But if you could speak to how those terms were used then.
Right. And the research that I've done, I've found that they get kind of interchangeable. And I'm actually, my brain is thinking about one of my colleagues who may be on here or not, but who could definitely speak to this a little bit better than I can. But it's kind of that same sort of thing with Pinchot and Muir. Which one, where is this line between preservation and conservation? Because when we talk about Muir, we talk about him being a member of the American conservation movement. So he is part of that. And so, that, and I think it kind of really, you start to get into really parsing the language with conservation, especially. Preservation is pretty straightforward, but conservation seems to have a very big tent for which it operates in, is that you can be a conservationist and a preservationist, or not, So yeah, that's a tricky one there.
I don't think the term conservation really emerges until late 1890s, but definitely in the first decade of the 1900s.
Yeah.
Now Pinchot claims to have coined the term in his memoir, Breaking New Ground, but that's not entirely true. Because they're over in, I think it was in British India, they were using the term, I think they were using it, or there were conservatories. It was in the air, if you will. But I don't think in the 1880s the term conservation was popular, if used at all here in the United States. So
yeah.
But well, Mike, thank you so much.
All right, thank you
for the presentation.